What does a face lose when the world keeps asking it to stay young forever? In Hollywood, beauty was never just something people admired. It became an expectation, a source of pressure, and for some stars, a burden they carried for years. Behind the polished red carpets and camera-ready smiles were faces left swollen, skin stretched too tight, eyes that no longer moved the same way, and features altered until the person underneath seemed to disappear. Some wanted a subtle fix. Some wanted to outrun age. Others kept going until the damage could no longer be hidden. This is where glamour turns clinical, and where one decision in the mirror can leave a mark no fame can erase. There was a time when Linda Evangelista did not just walk into fashion. She seemed to reset it. In the 1990s, her face was one of the most recognizable in the world. Sharp yet elegant, strong yet endlessly adaptable, the kind of beauty that could look severe in one campaign and almost fragile in the next. Designers loved that balance because it gave her face movement, tension, and mystery. But the same industry that once celebrated her features also helped create the fear that those features could fade. Years after becoming a supermodel icon, Linda underwent cool sculpting, a non-surgical fat reduction treatment that was supposed to refine the body without leaving visible damage. Instead, according to her own later account, it left her with paradoxical adipose hyperplasia, a rare complication that caused the treated areas to harden and enlarge rather than shrink. What followed was not the polished afterglow people associate with celebrity beauty treatments. It was something far more unsettling. The body she had built a career around no longer responded the way she expected, and the emotional effect spilled across her whole public image. In photos from that period, people did not see the old ease. They saw a woman hiding. The face that once looked so clean and controlled now carried the heaviness of someone forced into retreat. Even without dramatic facial surgery, the visible aftermath still changed how the public read her. Tension settled into her expression. The confidence that once lived in her jawline and eyes seemed buried under distress, isolation, and the private humiliation of looking altered by a procedure sold as simple. That is what makes Linda's story darker than most. She was not chasing excess in the usual tabloid sense. She was caught by the promise of something subtle, modern, and supposedly safe. When she finally spoke openly, the story landed with force because it exposed a truth the beauty industry rarely advertises. Sometimes the damage is not theatrical. Sometimes it arrives quietly, then takes everything from the person who thought they were only making a small correction. And the next story proves how even a familiar face can become painfully unfamiliar. For decades, Kenny Rogers looked like the kind of man America trusted on sight. His face carried exactly what his voice carried: warmth, steadiness, and a lived-in honesty that made songs like The Gambler feel even more believable. He was never built around polished perfection. He was built around familiarity. That rugged face, the relaxed eyes, the easy smile, all of it helped create the sense that he was not performing wisdom. He had earned it. But by the 1990s, age was starting to show more sharply under brighter studio lights and clearer television screens, and the pressure to soften those signs quietly grew around him. In stories like his, the goal is rarely to become someone new. It is usually far sadder than that. The patient wants to keep the version of themselves the public once loved, as if the younger face in old photographs can somehow be brought forward into the present again. The transcript says his procedures were meant to subtly refresh his look, not redefine it. What followed was the opposite of subtle. After undergoing a facelift and eyelid surgery, Kenny's face no longer carried that same loose, natural ease. The skin appeared tighter. The eye area changed in a way fans immediately noticed, and the familiar balance of his features seemed off. What once looked rugged and expressive now looked pulled, smoothed over, and strangely distant. For a singer whose face had always felt open and reassuring, that kind of change landed hard. People were not just seeing an older man trying to look younger. They were seeing a face that no longer moved with the same identity. Many struggled to recognize him at all. Kenny later admitted he felt disconnected from his own reflection, and that is the detail that gives this story its real weight. Regret sounds different when it comes from someone who was not chasing vanity, but trying to hold on to something familiar, and lost it in the process. His music remained untouched, his voice remained unmistakable, and his legacy survived the damage. But the mirror had already done what the camera made permanent. And the next face on this list shows how one signature feature can become a lifelong trap. In later interviews, Lisa Rinna spoke openly about one of the cosmetic choices that stayed with her for years. That matters, because by the time she addressed it publicly, her lips were no longer just one feature among many. They had become the first thing people saw. Before that, Lisa had the kind of face television loves. Sharp, playful, restless, and expressive down to the smallest reaction. She could turn a look into a punchline and a smile into a provocation. Her features moved easily, and that movement was part of her appeal. But once a single detail becomes tied to fame, it can stop feeling like a detail at all. It becomes a signature to protect. In stories like this, the patient is often not trying to become someone else. They are trying to hold on to the feature that made them memorable, then push it a little further, until the feature begins to overpower the face around it. That shift is what made Lisa's transformation so hard to ignore. What had once looked distinctive eventually began to look heavy, over-defined, and too dense for the rest of her face. The lips no longer framed her expressions naturally. They started to dominate them. In some appearances, the upper lip looked swollen enough to pull attention away from her eyes, while the lower face seemed tighter and more managed, as if spontaneity had been replaced by maintenance. The problem with changes like that is not only that people notice them, it is that they stop seeing the person as a whole. They fixate on the intervention, the imbalance, the feature that now seems to arrive before the personality does. Lisa later admitted that the long-term effects of silicone in her lips brought consequences she had to live with for years. That honesty gave the story more weight than gossip ever could. Because this was not just about vanity. It was about what happens when one cosmetic decision settles into the face and refuses to leave quietly. She was still recognizable, but the softness of proportion had been interrupted. And once that happens, even a familiar face can start to feel trapped inside its own most famous feature. And the next story takes that loss of proportion to a far more extreme place. By the time many viewers saw Joan Van Ark again in later public appearances, the first reaction was not recognition. It was hesitation. Something about the face people remembered from television seemed harder to locate. The softness was still there in fragments, but it was buried under tighter contours, altered balance, and an expression that no longer rested as naturally as it once had. That contrast hit especially hard because Joan had never been famous for severe beauty. She was remembered for something gentler. On Knots Landing, her face carried warmth, delicacy, and an ease that made her feel instantly familiar. She did not need dramatic features to be memorable. The appeal was in the harmony. And in stories like this, that is often exactly what the patient is trying to save. Not a fantasy version of the face, but the original mood of it. The hope is usually simple. Smooth a few signs of age, hold on to what people loved, and return to the screen looking like time had only brushed past. But once that process begins, harmony can be the first thing to disappear. According to the original script, Joan reportedly started with a subtle rhinoplasty in the early 1990s, then later became associated with multiple facial procedures, including facelifts, eyelid surgery, and various skin treatments. The result was not one shocking change all at once. It was accumulation. The nose looked more refined, the skin more stretched, the eye area more controlled, until the overall face began to feel less spontaneous and more managed. What people once read as softness started giving way to visible tension. The cheeks and mouth appeared more fixed. The eyes seemed less open, as if the natural emotional flow of the face had been interrupted by too much correction. That is what makes Joan Van Ark's transformation so unsettling. It was not just that she looked different. It was that the emotional temperature of her face changed. Viewers who once saw warmth began seeing strain. By the time high-definition television made every line and contour easier to study, the conversation around her appearance often grew louder than the work that made her famous. And in that kind of silence, when the person says little and the public keeps staring, the face itself becomes the story. The next one, however, is even more complicated, because the transformation was tied not only to beauty, but also to illness, surgery, and survival. Sometimes people believe plastic surgery can bring them back to the person they used to be. But what happens when that promise fails, or when age, illness, and cosmetic intervention begin to collide in the same face? Cayetana Fitz-James Stewart became one of the clearest examples of that tension. As the Duchess of Alba, she was not just another public figure. She represented one of the oldest and most powerful aristocratic families in Spain, a woman surrounded by titles, wealth, art, and history. Her original appearance carried that old-world distinction naturally. The face was delicate, noble, and unmistakably hers. But by the 1980s, as the visible signs of aging became harder to ignore, she reportedly turned toward cosmetic procedures in an effort to preserve a younger version of herself, or at least to keep her public image from slipping too far from what people remembered. What followed was not one dramatic transformation overnight, but a gradual layering of change. According to the original script, what began as minor cosmetic adjustments reportedly developed into repeated facelifts and injectable treatments. Over time, the natural balance of her face seemed harder to find. Some later appearances showed skin that looked pulled and tightened in one area, then fuller and heavier in another, creating an overall impression that felt both rigid and swollen at once. And that is where her case became even more unsettling. The transcript notes that she also lived with Melkerson-Rosenthal syndrome, a rare condition that can cause facial swelling. That made it difficult to separate medical change from cosmetic aftermath. But it also made the final image more haunting. The public was no longer looking at simple vanity. They were looking at a face shaped by time, treatment, and illness, all at once. What makes Cayetana's story linger is that she never shrank under the scrutiny. Even as the media fixated on her altered appearance, she remained bold, eccentric, and fiercely independent. Her marriage in later life only reinforced that spirit. But the face the public kept studying had already become something heavier than beauty. It had turned into evidence of a losing fight against time, complicated by a body that no longer followed clean cosmetic logic. And the next story moves even deeper into that territory, because this time the pressure did not come only from aging, but from growing up inside one of the most scrutinized families in the world. By the time LaToya Jackson appeared in later public photos, the change was no longer something people tried to describe gently. The face the public remembered had become harder to find. In its place was a version that looked narrower, tighter, more sculpted, and somehow less settled, as if too many adjustments had been pulling in different directions at once. That reaction was especially intense because LaToya had once carried a much softer presence. In her younger years, her features looked balanced, delicate, and naturally feminine, with none of the sharpness that later became so striking. But LaToya was never allowed to exist as just one person in the public eye. She was part of the Jackson family, and that meant her face was always being read beside other faces, judged inside a dynasty the world could never stop examining. In that kind of environment, cosmetic change can stop being about vanity alone. It can become about control, comparison, and the quiet need to reshape what constant scrutiny has made unbearable. That pressure seemed to show itself gradually in her features. According to the original script, repeated cosmetic procedures altered the natural balance of her face over time, especially around the nose, cheeks, and overall facial structure. The nose appeared more narrowed and refined, but also more fragile, as if too much of its original softness had been stripped away. In contrast, the cheeks sometimes looked fuller, creating a face that seemed sharpened in one place and padded in another. The skin often appeared smoother and more managed, while the eyes seemed less expressive beneath the increasing precision of everything around them. And that is where the transformation became unsettling. The face no longer looked like it had simply been refreshed. It looked assembled, corrected again and again, until the original emotional flow of it began to disappear. The darker edge of Toya's story came from the fact that none of these changes were ever viewed privately. Her appearance became part of a larger Jackson family spectacle, where faces were not just seen, but constantly compared. She was not simply growing older in public. She was being measured against memory, legacy, and an impossible standard of control. Once that kind of pressure settles into the mirror, the result can feel less like reinvention and more like erosion. The next story moves into a different kind of damage, where the face stayed glamorous, but the effort to preserve it became harder and harder to ignore. Goldie Hawn built her entire screen presence on something cosmetic. Procedures can never truly manufacture. Lightness, her laugh, her bright eyes, the slightly unruly warmth in her expression. All of it made her feel less like a star performing charm and more like someone charm simply happened to. That is why even subtle changes to her face drew attention so quickly. When a celebrity's appeal comes from glamour, the public often accepts polish. But when the appeal comes from spontaneity, any sign of control can feel like a loss. Goldie's beauty never depended on severity. It depended on ease. And that kind of face is especially vulnerable to the pressures of aging, because even small changes around the eyes or cheeks can interrupt the personality people thought they knew. Over the years, media speculation around Goldie Hawn has often centered on cosmetic treatments, such as Botox and facial fillers, though she has never publicly confirmed many of the details. That uncertainty matters, because her story belongs to a murkier category than some of the others on this list. The changes were never framed as one dramatic procedure gone wrong. They seemed to arrive quietly, in the smoother forehead, the firmer mid-face, the slightly more controlled contours that appeared during later public events. In some photos, the skin looked polished enough to soften the natural crinkling that once gave her face so much emotional life. In others, the cheeks appeared fuller, creating a look that felt less loose and effortless than before. The result was not grotesque. It was more unsettling than that. It was the feeling that a face built on natural movement was becoming just a little more managed than its spirit wanted it to be. That is why Goldie Hawn's case lingers in a quieter way. The public was not reacting to a shocking collapse, but to a gradual fading of the softness that made her beloved. Even so, her story resists easy cruelty. Her legacy was never built on perfect skin or frozen youth. It lived in vitality, humor, and a deeply human presence that still comes through. The next story goes in the opposite direction, because this time the woman at the center of it never really pretended she was aiming for naturalness in the first place. Dolly Parton once joked, "If something sags, I'll fix it." The line was funny, blunt, and very Dolly, but it also revealed something deeper about the way she approached beauty. Unlike many celebrities on this list, she never tried to pretend her image was untouched by cosmetic help. From the beginning, Dolly understood that her public face was part of a larger performance, one built on platinum hair, stage sparkle, and a look so stylized it was almost mythic. In her younger years, her features already carried softness and brightness. But fame pushed that image into something bigger, more deliberate, and more theatrical. For some patients, the wish behind cosmetic surgery is to return to youth. For Dolly, it seemed closer to authorship. She was not trying to reclaim an old face. She was shaping a version of herself that matched the larger-than-life persona the world had come to expect. That decision changed her appearance over time, but in a way she never hid. Entertainment coverage and her own public comments have long linked her to rhinoplasty, eyelid work, facelifts, Botox, and fillers, all discussed with a kind of mischievous honesty few stars can manage. The result was a face that became progressively smoother, tighter, and more polished, yet still unmistakably hers. The skin looked firmer, the eye area more lifted, and the overall structure more controlled than in her early years. But unlike many transformations that leave the face looking emotionally distant, Dolly's still carried intention. The glamour was obvious, the maintenance impossible to miss, yet the expression never seemed embarrassed by its own artifice. It leaned into it. That is what sets her apart from nearly everyone else on this list. Dolly's face was altered, yes, but it was never presented as a tragic secret or a failed attempt at natural beauty. It became part of the costume, part of the legend, part of the deal she made openly with the public. The darkness in her story is not regret, but endurance, the lifelong pressure of having to preserve an icon once the icon becomes larger than the person beneath it. And from here, the story moves toward an ending, because after all these faces, one question still hangs over the entire list. Some of these stars were trying to look younger, some were trying to hold on to a familiar face, and some may have believed that one small change could bring back the version of themselves the public once adored. But story after story, the outcome often felt the same. The mirror gave them something tighter, smoother, or more controlled, yet somehow further away from who they used to be. That may be the cruelest part of all. In Hollywood, plastic surgery is often sold as a way to preserve beauty. But in the wrong hands, or after too many attempts, it can erase the very thing people were trying to save. If this side of celebrity history interests you, stay with us and subscribe for more stories still hiding behind the spotlight.